Lester, a convert to Judaism whose major field of interest was Jewish studies. By contrast, many of the most prominent authorities on Black history and Black sociology have been Jews. I think immediately of Melville Hershkowitz, who wrote The Myth of the Negro Past, Frank Tannenbaum, Slave and Citizen, Charles Silberman, Crisis in Black and White, among others. The field of Black history in America is studied with such names as Herbert Athaker, Ira Berlin, Philip Forner, Herbert Gutman, George Rawick, Seth Schreiner, Robert Fogel, the co-winner of the 1993 Nobel Prize in Economics, co-authored the most controversial economic analysis of slavery, Time on the Cross. And Stanley Elkins wrote Slavery, a Problem in America Institutional Intellectual Life, probably the most debated study of the impact of slavery on African Americans. The historian Peter Novick, in his volume, The Noble Dream, The Objectivity Question, and the American Historical Profession, noted a difference in the way that non-Jewish and Jewish historians have approached Black history. While white historians wrote of white attitudes and behavior towards Blacks, George Frederickson, Winthrop Jordan, C. Van Woodward were usually Gentiles. Those white historians who wrote of Blacks were subjects that were generally Jews. Jews seemingly were better able to write about African Americans from the Black point of view. Thus, Herbert Gutman wrote a mammoth history of the Black family, and Lawrence Levine wrote an outstanding book on Afro-American folk culture. Nell Painter, a contemporary Black historian, claimed that while most white historians wrote from a white perspective, historians like Levine and Gutman, quote, were able to think about history in what I'd call Black ways. Jewish spokespeople emphasized that this affinity of Jews towards African Americans stemmed not only from idealism, but also from self-interest. The Jewish community would benefit the more America moved toward a society of merit in which religious, ethnic, and racial barriers were unimportant. 1 year before the Supreme Court outlawed school segregation in the 1954 Brown versus Topeka Board of Education decision, the Jewish Community Relations Advisory Council declared, in a still imperfect society, Jews, together with many other groups, suffer from inequalities of opportunity and other forms of discrimination. Jewish leaders stressed the similarities rather than the differences between the Jewish and Black experience in America. Both groups, they asserted, were powerless and victims of persecution. Both groups included in their ranks martyrs to American intolerance. Leo Frank, in the case of Jews, and Emmett Till, in the case of Blacks. The murder of James Chaney and Andrew Goodman and Michael Schwerner in Mississippi in 1964 strengthened the presumption that the fates of Blacks and Jews were intertwined. This presumption has continued to resonate among American Jews. One curious manifestation of this was the PBS documentary film Liberators, Fighting on Two Fronts in World War II. This film and an accompanying book that appeared simultaneously described the roles of Black soldiers in liberating Jews from Buchenwald and Dachau in April of 1945. The film opened on the 54th anniversary of Kristallnacht at Alice Tully Hall and Lincoln Center in New York City, with Jesse Jackson and other Black luminaries in attendance. 1 month later, it was screened at the renowned Apollo Theater in Harlem under the sponsorship of a group calling itself the Liberators Commemoration Committee. The screening was followed by a reception attended by Black leaders, Black veterans of World War II, along with Holocaust survivors. Liberators could not have appeared at a more fortuitous time for New York City politicians and African American and Jewish leaders. Mayor David Dinkins hoped that it would lessen tensions between Black and Jewish communities that had exacerbated by the 1991 riots in Crown Heights and the refusal in October of 1992 of a Brooklyn jury to convict Lemrick Nelson of the murder of Yankel Rosenbaum. Dinkins had been elected in 1989 as the city's first Black mayor, and he emphasized during the election campaign that he could best heal the city's ethnic and racial divisions. Dinkins' hope for re-election depended on support among Jewish voters, and Liberators, with its premiere that Jews and Blacks shared a common agenda, was grist for his political mill. The New York City Board of Education planned to distribute copies of the documentary to all of the city's public junior and senior high schools, and Jewish philanthropists competed for the privilege of funding that operation. They hoped that the film could help stem the tide of increasing African American anti-Semitism and repair the badly frayed Black Jewish liberal coalition. The documentary Liberators received an Academy Award nomination for Best Documentary, even after doubts had been raised by Black World War II veterans, by Holocaust survivors, and Holocaust historians regarding the film's veracity. It soon became crystal clear that Black soldiers had never liberated Dachau nor Buchenwald, although they had been in the vicinity. Jeffrey Goldberg, at that time the New York City bureau chief for The Forward, the Jewish English language weekly, blew the whistle on Liberators. And in an essay titled The Exaggerators, which appeared in the New Republic, Goldberg quoted the denials of both Black soldiers and survivors that Blacks had liberated Dachau and Buchenwald. The American Jewish Committee issued a 15-page report which concluded that Liberators contained serious factual flaws that went well beyond what could be written off as artistic license. The Black veterans were particularly angry regarding the liberties that had been taken with the truth. I first went to Buchenwald in 1991 with PBS, one Black soldier who appeared in the film told Goldberg. The Black soldier had had an enviable record of service in Europe in 1944 and 1945. And they did not want this record sullied by fantasies which, once discredited, could bring into question their wartime performance. E.G. McConnell, one of those soldiers, said, "We had been stripped of our history and our slavery, and I didn't want to come up with anything that could tarnish our record." But apparently, some other people didn't mind a few lies. Perhaps the most interesting aspect to me of the controversy surrounding Liberators was not the deceit practiced by Nina Rosenblum, the film's Jewish co-creator, but her continual refusal to recant even after the movie's misrepresentations had been exposed and the film's videotape had been withdrawn from circulation. She described as racists those whites who would deprive Black units of credit for liberating Dachau and Buchenwald. This, she argued, even though the Black veterans themselves had been the very first to raise doubts about the film. Rosenblum, in fact, described McConnell as severely brain damaged due to being hit in the head with shrapnel during the war. The Black veterans were not the only Blacks who objected to the film. Blacks who had been involved in the making of the film soon realized that their artistic integrity had been compromised for the sake of Rosenblum's political and social agenda. Rosenblum was not the only Jew unwilling to allow the minor point of historical accuracy to detract from the laudable effort to cement Black-Jewish relations. If the film was not factually true, they seemed to be saying, so much the worse for truth. Peggy Tishman, one of the co-hosts of the Apollo showing, asked rhetorically, why would anyone want to exploit the idea that this is a fraud? What we're trying to do is make New York a better place for you and me to live. The truth of the film was subsidiary to its role in reviving a Black-Jewish alliance. For Jews on the left, Liberators was a disaster, not because it was a fraud, but because it encouraged those elements within the Jewish community who were skeptical of the Black-Jewish alliance. Having said that, I'd like to turn for a moment with you to a statement that's repeated in the Torah more than any other verse. According to the Talmud, it's actually repeated 36 different times in the Torah. And that verse is, you shall love the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. That verse is the rationale of our relationship with the weak, with the oppressed, with the afflicted. In Deuteronomy, God addresses the people as God of all gods and Lord of all lords, the great God, the mighty and awesome, who regards not persons nor takes rewards, God who does justice for the fatherless and the widow, and loves the stranger in giving him food and raiment. Therefore, you shall love the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. So why the repetition? Why the insistence? Because it's not easy to love the stranger. What claim does the stranger have upon us? They are not members of our family, nor are they of our tribe, nor our people, nor our faith. So what should the stranger have a claim on me or mine? Why should we love the stranger? And what are you to do if you discover that the strangers whose heart you are to know does not love you? What if the stranger even curses you? And in many of the surveys, it's evident that anti-Semitism is on the rise in the United States. In the recent ADL survey, 1 in 5, nearly 40 million adults, are said to hold anti-Semitic views. In that study, it's maintained that African Americans are twice as likely as whites to hold anti-Semitic views. Among the stereotypes mentioned in the ADL survey of those are things such as, 1, Jews stick together more than any other Americans. Secondly, Jews are more loyal to Israel than America. Third, Jews have too much power in the business world. Fourth, Jews have too much control and influence on Wall Street. Among Black extremists, there are even more sinister stereotypes that exist. A widely distributed book in the Afrocentric movement was a book that was written by Michael Bradley, and it was entitled The Iceman Inheritance: Prehistorical Sources of Western Man's Racism, Sexism, and Aggression. In the book, its thesis proposes that white people are so vicious because they're so unlike the rest of humanity. They are descended from the brutish Neanderthals, and Jews are the oldest of the Neanderthal Caucasoids, the iciest of the ice people, all of which explains the singularly odious character of ancient Jewish culture. This reverse racism was spread by many of the African American intellectuals, including people like Leonard Jeffries, the former chairman of the Afro-American Studies Department at City College in New York. In his mind, the world was divided between European selfish ice people and African sun people. Africa, not Europe, he said, was the source of civilization. Blacks, not Jews, are the chosen people. And as columnist Louis Gates Jr. pointed out, this pseudo-scientific book was endorsed by members of the African Studies Department at City College, including their professors, along with their president. It was consistently attacked with what he calls the Jewish educational mafia and the Jewish role in subjugating Blacks. These voices and others were heard and continue to be heard around campuses of our society. College speakers and publications play an increasingly disturbing role on college campuses. They would carry the message of anti-Semitism. The Bible of the Black anti-Semitic movement was a book that was widely distributed in the Black community, that at one time was actually ordered by phone at 1-800-48-TRUTH. It was entitled The Secret Relationship Between Blacks and Jews. It was an official publication of the Nation of Islam. And the book boasted 1,275 footnotes in the course of 334 pages. It charged Jews with being operators in the historic crime of slavery, playing an inordinate and disproportionate role. Jews carved out for themselves, and I quote, a monumental culpability in slavery. Jews are responsible for the Black Holocaust. That the overwhelming majority of slave trade, in fact, took place by Arabs in Arab countries, and indeed by Blacks, is hardly of little interest to the determined anti-Semite. Their interest is to distort the history and character of the Jewish people and Judaism by claiming that Jews dominated the slave trade. The absurdity reminds me of the incident in which the Black extremist burst into the office of the Jewish principal of a certain New England State College shouting, "Your people kept slaves." And the president replied softly, "Where? In Minsk?" The dangerous part of mentality is its assignment of evil as the essential racial nature of the ice people. And like the myth in Christian orthodoxy, it persists on assigning people with guilt. The counselors of benign neglect prefer washing their hands of the whole mess and returning to the chocolate cities and the vanilla suburbs. Such a stance, understandable as it may be in the presence of Black anti-Semitism, is a betrayal of our own dignity as Jews and a betrayal of our vow to love the stranger and to know his heart. We are dealing with a deeply leaderless, confused, and oftentimes hopeless people. These are not our true enemies. These people, for all their similarities with our own immigration past, are very different from us. They did not come to these shores to escape persecution to freedom. They were dragged here against their will in 1619, dragged away from the freedom of Africa into the slavery of America. Their wives, daughters, and mothers were raped. Their sons were lynched. They suffered incessant public humiliation. Traveling in the South in the 50s, came to face to face with toilets labeled black and white. Only in 1954, in the Brown versus the Board of Education case, did the court finally declare that the notion of separate but equal rights was unconstitutional. Out of the 2 black children lived in poverty. Their parents are the last employed, and they were the first fired. They were angry. Worse, they may have surrendered anger for hopelessness. Too many were surrounded by a culture of despair. So then how are we to deal with the rise of Black anti-Semitism? Certainly not to deny it, nor to ignore it, but most assuredly, we're not to lump an entire Black people into the same category of extreme Black racists. Louis Farrakhan is not the whole of Black leadership. It's equally wrong-headed to depict the action of any hoodlums or looters with the actions and views of the Black community. Distinctions need to be made. These kinds of distinctions, I believe, lie at the heart of ethical wisdom. Jews, after the Crown Heights tragedy in New York, kept asking where the Black leaders were to denounce the anti-Jewish shouts and the Black mobs. The truth is that there were such Black leaders, and they deserve to be known. Some of the Black leaders who denounced the anti-Semitism of the Black community figures, people like Roscoe Brown, the head of 100 Black Men, Dennis Wolcott, the chief executive of the Urban League, Michael Myers, the director of the New York Civil Liberties Coalition, Mary Plinkett and Eleanor Holmes Norton. Examine the case of the old-time primary election in which Gus Savage, a congressman, notorious for his racism, ran for re-election. Savage called Jews responsible for Black genocide, told his followers to vote for him, saying the election should turn on how you feel about Jews rather than how you feel about Blacks. Gus Savage was opposed by another Black candidate, Mel Reynolds, who addressed the Black community in this manner. He said, the Black community in Chicago is in danger of losing its moral authority on the issue of race if it allows Gus Savage to use hate to get elected. Voters, not only from suburban, but from urban areas who had previously supported Gus Savage, this time made Mel Reynolds the winner. The defeat and the victory, I think, are important to remember. The city of Berkeley, California, when Jesse Jackson was running for president in the primaries, had an anti-Zionist referendum which sought to chastise Israel for its policies and embarrass it. The result of that election was that the Black precincts who voted overwhelmingly for Jesse Jackson joined the rest of the population in defeating the vicious anti-Zionist flank. Since 1967, at least 11 surveys among the population at large reported that 7 out of 10 Blacks are more sympathetic to Israel than to the Arabs. It must not be forgotten that the Black caucus in Congress voted to support Israel militarily and economically. And it's important, I think, to keep steady vision and not be overwhelmed by Black extremists and not to allow evil to cast us into a mood of cynicism or despair. For the future of society, for the ongoing relationship between Jews and African Americans, I think it's vital that we learn to differentiate good from evil. The beating of the white truck driver, Reginald Denny, was an inexcusable abomination. But were it not for the 4 Blacks, Denny would have been beaten dead. We must know the names of those people: Titus Murphy, Terry Barnett, Bobby Green, and Leigh Yulee. They did something that is heartening and heroic. As one of them said, watching the beating on television, somebody's got to get that guy out of there. Good people of all colors are too often buried in the anonymity of footnotes. Who recalls Gregory Allen Williams, who, seeing the LA outbreak on television, came to rescue from further beating Victor Hirata? Martin Luther King Jr. wrote, "We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly." His words brought to mind, to me, The Defiant Ones, a movie that dealt with the escape of 2 prisoners from a Southern jail who were chained and shackled together. One of the fugitives was white, the other Black, and little love was lost between them. But they were chained together, held together by a common enemy. The posse and the sheriffs who pursued them were determined to return them to the chain gang. The image became for me a metaphor for contemporary Black and Jewish relationships. We are chained together by invisible bonds. We have one common enemy, a common Pharaoh who seeks to return us to Egypt. And ironically, the mind of that enemy may help clarify our understanding of who we are to each other. Consider for a moment the near victory of David Duke, the born-again Christian risen from the white sheets of the Ku Klux Klan, when he ran for the governor of the state of Louisiana. David Duke had more than 700,000 votes, but he lost. And who defeated him? Jews and African Americans. Jews couldn't beat Duke by themselves. Blacks couldn't beat Duke by themselves, but they could do it together. Against that common enemy, we need each other. We share enemies, but our hurts are not the same. There's a story told of 2 people on a New York subway. One is a Jew, the other is a Black man who's reading a Yiddish newspaper. The Jew approaches him and asks him, "Excuse me, mister, are you Jewish?" The Black man responds, "Nor das fehlt mir," which translates roughly, "That's all I need." The story reminds me that one of the irritants in the dialogue between Blacks and Jews is the matter of comparative victimology. It's not my term, it's a term that was used that came out of Harvard University. Jews cannot understand how it is that Blacks place them in the category of whitey. Jews understandably begin with the assumption that they share with African Americans a common experience of oppression. After all, we're all victims of the Holocaust. But we must learn to know the heart of the stranger. Julius Lester, the Black Jewish professor in the Judaica Near Eastern Studies Department of the University of Massachusetts, once observed that it's an assumption that many Blacks find offensive and historically inaccurate. He knows that there are, in truth, no 2 peoples in Western history who have suffered as much as Jews and Blacks. But when one looks at Blacks and Jews in the context of American history, the commonality of the experience fades. Jews came to America seeking freedom from religious persecution. Blacks were brought to America to be enslaved. In America, Jews found more freedom than anywhere else in the diaspora. Anti-Semitism in America is real, but it cannot be compared, nor should it be compared, to 200 years of slavery and its tragic legacy. The answer, "Nur das fehlt mir," that's all I need, expresses that uniqueness and suffering that belongs to African Americans. Despite anti-Semitism, Jews had light skins. They could attempt to assimilate. They could shorten their names, but Blacks could not bleach themselves white. Jews can be invisible. Blacks are always identifiable. Consequently, we have to be sensitive in using the Holocaust in dealing with the Black situation. In the 60s, James Baldwin wrote, "One does not wish to be told by an American Jew that his suffering is as great as the American Negro's suffering. It isn't, and one knows it isn't from the very tone in which he assures you that it is. We suffer differently." There we are. Okay, we're back. We're chained together, but neither psychologically nor economically nor politically are we the same. If memory serves me correctly, in the Defiant Ones, even when the chain is severed, the treatment of the white man in the home of the white family is different from the treatment of the Black man. Beyond pragmatism, what is the stranger to me? We're a compassionate people, and we're of a compassionate God, whom we identify in one of the most stirring of prayers, El Malei Rachamim, God who is filled with compassion. It's hard to love the stranger, but it's essential to know the heart of the stranger, lest we lose heart in our own. How do we learn by heart? First of all, I think by reminding our children, who in many ways are a generation without memory, who in many of our proud historic heritage and relationship with the Black community, by reminding them that Jews, such as Arthur Spingarn and Kivi Kaplan, the Jewish president of the NAACP, by reminding them that in 1964, half or more of the white young people who went to Mississippi to work with Black people were Jews, and that proportionately more rabbis went down south that were jailed and beaten than any other group of clergymen. By reminding them of the three young men, two Jews and a Black, Schwerner, Goodman, and Cheney, who were buried alive with their eyes wide open in the clay of Mississippi, fighting for the rights of the Blacks to vote. We can't always control the streets, but in our homes and in our table talk, our children, I think, need to know where our hearts are. Even if our hands are bound, even if we don't know exactly what to do, we can teach them that no racist remark will go unanswered, and no denigration of another people will go unchallenged. It's important for our children to know that we Jews don't act that way, that we Jews don't talk that way. We Jews will not die from being bleeding hearts, but we may die from becoming frozen souls. We will not die from taking on too much, but we will die from becoming too little. Jews cannot turn their backs. We cannot surrender the struggle against racism or xenophobia because some of the victims simply don't like us. Because, again, from my perspective in the last analysis, we do not act out our ethics to gain the appreciation of others. We do not set our spiritual agenda either by the enemies who hate us or by the gratitude of those we help. Jewish honor, I think, demands involvement. And even more than that, I believe that Jewish honor carries with it a price. Who can help repair the world without cost? I think of one of the characters in Alan Patton's African novel who says, "When I go to heaven, the big judge will look at me and ask, 'Where are your wounds?' And I will say, 'I have none.' And he will say in turn, 'Was there nothing to fight for?' There is something important to fight for. The wounds, it seems to me, are a badge of Jewish nobility." Thank you. Any questions?
Oh, come here.
This is ridiculous.
Bring to, where's the other view?
Go ahead and
Excuse me?
unmute yourselves.
What?
Yeah,
In the upper right, where it says view, go to gallery view, then you'll see everybody.
Turn it off if you want to be seen.
I don't
Sure, go
care.
ahead.
okay, where are we? Rabbi, I have a question. You talked about the Jews having more of an, I'll use my word, interest in Black-Jewish relations than Blacks had in that relationship.
Position. Move yourself.
Do you, is part of the reason for that, in your view, that when Jews started engaging in the civil rights movement, that there was a suspicion on the part of Blacks?
You hit the word exactly, perfectly. This was the first time in the history of
Full.
Black American history
Break
that
it if you're going to.
anyone other than African Americans stepped forward. Any other cultural or religious group actually stepped forward en masse to try to make a difference in the African American situation. So I think early on, it was greeted with great suspicion. It was the suspicion where they were asking themselves, what's in it for them? What are they looking for from us? Why would anyone do this, since they'd never experienced that in the past? I mean, I think over time it's shown that Jews had no prior agenda other than to do the work of helping. But I think it took a long time, and in the minds still of many African Americans, they still believe there's some sort of an agenda. But I think that's partially the anti-Semitism, the Black anti-Semitism that's speaking.
Isn't one of the problems that so many of the leaders now weren't alive at that time to experience that coalition between Jews and Blacks?
Well, I think yes, you have to read about it. Right, many of them were not alive, and it's
Or not in this country.
or not in this country. I mean, it's coming to them second and third hand. And in other words, it wasn't a primary experience for them. And because it wasn't a primary experience, I think they also are a little bit hesitant to step forward, even though there are places like the Jewish Religious Action Center and the ADL and the Jewish Committee and all of these organizations that really continue to step up and try to make a difference in the life of African Americans in the United States. I think that there are not enough Jews, younger Jews today, who have seen that of the past. In other words, had a primary experience with it. And I think I believe that not enough people who were alive back then actually taught their children about it. That's what I was talking about towards the end. That I think that, you know, we kept silent about it. We went and we acted and we did, but we didn't pass it on. We didn't pass on the tradition to the next generation. And I think this generation is, I won't say morally bankrupt, I will say morally hesitant to step into what they think is a void when it's not really a void. We've always been there.
Rabbi, what about Southern Jews? How involved were they? Because having come from the North, everybody I knew obviously was from the North.
Mhm.
The 3 students that were murdered were from the North.
Right. There were probably more Northerners than Southerners, but that doesn't mean that the Southern Jewish community was completely silent. I think they once they began to see Northerners come down, they began to follow their lead. But there were a number of Southern rabbis. I don't have the names off the top of my head, but there were a number of Southern rabbis who did try to make a big difference in the racial issues that were taking place in the South. There were a number of Jews who were active in the Underground Railroad. There was a synagogue in Savannah, Georgia. The rabbi there, I can't remember the name, but the rabbi of the Savannah, Georgia synagogue was extremely active in anti-racial activities, as was the Reform rabbi in the synagogue, the big synagogue in Atlanta called the Temple. He also was very much active and involved in anti-racial activities. So I don't think that Southern Jews stepped to the plate as readily and as heartily as Northern Jews did. But once Northern Jews started to flow down, Southern Jews began to pick up the slack. Good
It's
question.
interesting because
Good
I know some Southern Jews who were very, very prejudiced.
Oh, I'm sure. Prejudice was in the air in the South, and I think it also may have depended on where the rabbi came from, whether the rabbi emanated from the South. I mean, a number of the rabbis who went to the South to serve Southern congregations were actually from the North, and it's they who brought this kind of liberal attitude and connection to social justice to their congregations, and their congregations picked up on it. Now, there were also, the other thing I think that you have to consider is whether or not these Jews in the South were members of these congregations. Did they have an outlet, or did they have someone trying to teach them or preach to them what the Jewish involvement in these causes and in these cases should be? I don't know. The people that were they members of congregations like that? It was first and foremost the Reform congregations, secondly the conservative congregations, and thirdly the Orthodox congregations that stepped in that order. But it wasn't until the Reform and the Orthodox really began to make a difference that Orthodox Jews began to participate in that cause.
It
Thank you.
seems to me in Naples and in many places, the difference is between urban Jews and suburban Jews that may not have had the exposure to a mixed community the
Mhm.
way people from New York, Boston,
Yeah.
those places
That could be,
have a different experience.
that could be part of it, that their daily experience was different. Not that there wasn't, any anti-racial attitudes in the North. There were, but not nearly what it was, like in the South. And, them just sort of growing up in the North probably gave them a different viewpoint than those people who grew up and only saw what was going on in the South, who had no connection or who had no relatives that would ever come down from the North.
But I was distinguishing even in the North between urban communities and suburban communities.
Mhm.
That the urban people acted very different, and the people down here that are from urban communities act different and less afraid of the
Okay.
other.
Sure, because in the urban communities, there were larger Black communities than there were in the suburban communities. That's what I was talking about with the chocolate cities and the vanilla suburbs that were mostly split on black and white lines.
Rabbi, I had a question, or actually Shelley had the question. From 1619 forward, when Blacks were brought here as slaves, were there, and I'm assuming there were some Jewish slave owners?
Very few. There were Jewish slave owners. Yes, there were Jewish slave owners in the South, but there were not nearly as many as people may think. Their numbers were exceedingly few, but they did exist. They did exist, and I'm not going to say to you that they did not further the racial divide between the Black and white community, but in terms of the totality of slave owners, the total number of slave owners, there were very few Jews who had slaves. And there were different kinds of slaves also. There were slaves that worked the field, there were house slaves, there were slaves that worked in factories. There were different kinds of slaves. And I do not know the breakdown, although I suppose I could find out. I don't know the breakdown of what kinds of slaves worked for Jewish slave owners. That I don't know. That I'm not sure, but I could certainly look that up. Because there is actually there's a recorded list. And when I was doing research for this, there's a recorded list of Jews who owned slaves in the South. So I could certainly find that out for you.
Rabbi, there's a museum in New Orleans called the Museum of Southern Jewish Experience.
Mm-hmm.
And we belong to that. And they had two Zoom conferences. One was Jews of the Mississippi Delta and growing up Jewish in Selma, Alabama.
Mhm.
And they had people who were born there and could relate. And with respect to Selma and the marching, the local Jews were totally not involved. There was a rabbi from Arlington Heights, Illinois, marching with the Black leaders at that time. And part of the reason was they said they were quite frightened and somewhat indifferent too, growing up there for generations. I think the first Jews arrived in the early 1820s or 30s, and many of them had property and stores, and they were, quite afraid of reprisal from joining the Northern Jews in this march for.
Because the Northerners could go back north and they would have to stay there.
They were left behind. And same thing in the Delta, growing up in Mississippi Delta. And some of the Jews on the call, their family still owns today cotton plantation farms, but they they made a point of saying the people that worked it, they started after the Civil War. Don't know if that's
I
true,
don't-
but it's certainly an easy comment on
When
it.
I was looking through some archives, I discovered, you know, some of the synagogues some of the southern synagogues who actually held programs or held activities that were anti-racial activities. And I mean, it doesn't give you numbers of people who participated. It just talks about what they did as a community or as a Jewish community. So as a Jewish community, I mean, there were Jews who were involved in certain activities. The numbers I can't speak to.
Well, in Selma today, they had a pretty good population years ago. It was 4. At the time of the Zoom, it was down to 3. One passed away. So
Wow.
Jews left in Selma.
Wow.
There's a book, The Jews of, I think it was the Jews of Charleston, South Carolina. And this book covered a number of states from the antebellum through.
Mhm.
Most of the Jews living in the South were totally on board with the concept of slavery.
Mhm.
As you said, very few owned, but when they emigrated and came to the southern states, they adopted and assimilated into the law of the land.
I just thought of another.
Yes, as it is, but they just accepted it from wherever they came from, and that was it.
I actually, while you were talking, I just thought of another interesting, what I think might be an interesting adult education course, and that's Southern Jewry. You know, to do something about Jews who grew up or who came to and grew up as Southerners. It might be interesting to. I'm going to look into that. Maybe a possibility for next year.
So Rabbi, it sounds as if in terms of the current generation, there's a lack of knowledge on their part of Black-Jewish relations, particularly as it related to the civil rights era.
Mhm.
And I take it that is a failing not only of the Jewish community, but also the Black community, the lack of education.
Yeah.
So again, we come back to education, always being the key.
Yep.
So going forward, what is your recommendation of how we address that issue?
Well, I think you find, or we find Black leaders in any, I mean, you start small, you start locally. I think you find Black leaders in any given community who are willing to sit down with Jewish leaders of the Jewish community and talk about the possibility, talk about two things. What can we do together? And secondly, how can we educate both communities? You know, what is the best way to educate both communities? I mean, I know that we did that up in the north when I was in Simsbury. We partnered with a number of Black churches and had activities together. But some of the activities, I mean, they weren't just social activities. They were educational activities, sort of to talk about what we need and what could be. Those were the that was sort of the 3-prong approach that we took. You know, what was the actual status of Jews and Blacks in the 20th century? What do we need now in the 21st century? And how do we achieve that together? I think that's the best way to approach it. But I've always found that in communities that I've been to, there are like-minded African-American leaders, whether they're clergy people, whether they're civic leaders. You try and touch base with them and to set up an initial meeting to talk about connecting those two communities. I mean, it starts it's sort of trivial to say, but it starts in a grassroots kind of way where you do it slowly and you do it individually. And then maybe if you have an ongoing program with each other, you expand out or you involve other people. The only problem that I found in sometimes involving other people is some programs that you do to avoid racial bias or to combat racial injustice. Sometimes smaller is better. Smaller groups work better than larger groups. I mean, it's true when you have larger groups, you have more people, but I think sometimes with smaller groups, you've got people that are more committed to the process. So that's the only caveat I would add in trying to set up that kind of a program.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Sure. Well, I thank everybody this afternoon. I hope you've learned a little bit of something. Our next adult education will take place on the 16th of November at 2:00. We're gonna look at a book that my guess is you've probably never read. It's called, in Hebrew, it's called Echa. It's the Book of Lamentations. I'm not sure if any of you have ever read it. I'm not sure if any of you have even ever heard of it, but it deals with the Book of Lamentations. Does anyone know when the Book of Lamentations is read in the Jewish year? Anyone?
Tisha
Tisha B'Av. Tisha
Yeah,
B'Av.
you were right.
Exactly. Tisha B'Av. Tisha B'Av. The commemoration of the destruction of the two temples in Jerusalem. That's when the book of Echa, the Book of Lamentations, is read. But there's some really interesting insights in the Book of Lamentations that deal with faith and deal with the concept of soul. And you don't find them actually anywhere else in the Bible. They're singularly unique to the Book of Lamentations. And the other reason I wanted to teach it is to give you a taste of something you've never really studied before, something you've probably never even known about before. So if you get a chance before that, take a look online, go look at the Book of Lamentations, or if you can look at the Book of Echa, it's E-I-C-H-A. It's not a very long book. I've called the talk or the talk that day, Faith in a Whirlwind. And I'll look forward to seeing you all on that. I'll look forward to seeing you all tomorrow, but I'll look forward to seeing you for that talk as well.
Rabbi, it was an excellent presentation. Thank
Thank
you. So much knowledge packed in